Hello everyone, this is Reach for the Sky, and this is the first in a series of short little videos that will be describing some of the tanks, hopefully eventually all of the tanks featured in War Thunder, and primarily the variants, and what distinguishes the variants of the same tank, because some tanks have different names, different variants, different versions, but they may outwardly appear very similar. But there are some distinct differences that make up the distinguishing features of a variant. For example, here we have the Panzer III, also known as the Panzer III, also known as the PZ3, also known as the tank that kind of resembles a tiger if you squint your eyes. Yeah, I'm doing that now, and it's sort of, yeah. Anyway, the Panzer III, in case you didn't know, is a German tank. The Germans are the people that built the Panzers. Panzer is a German word. Panzerkampfwagen literally translates into armoured fighting vehicle, and Ausführung translates into version. So the Panzerkampfwagen III Ausführung L means armoured fighting vehicle Model 3 version L. Okay, the first version that's featured in War Thunder is the E. Now I should probably make it clear that these videos are more about the historical side of things compared to the actual gameplay side of things, although I could cover that a little bit, because I'm sure there are people that would like to know how certain tanks are supposed to be played, because it's not always obvious, especially if you haven't come across these tanks in history books, television films, so on. Excuse me, got my cup of tea there. See, that's the thing about being British, you have to have at least 3,000 cups of tea a day or you start going into convulsions. So the Panzer III Ausf. You'll have to excuse the camo I've got on here. Back in my closed beta days I was putting some pretty crazy camo schemes on. The Panzer III started life as a multi-purpose vehicle. It was armed with the short-barreled 37mm KDBK 36. Not short-barreled in the sense of a howitzer, just short-barreled as in it wasn't a very long barrel, not long enough to really give it an impressive muzzle velocity, like say the Panzer IV F2 here with the long-barreled KWK 40. So the Germans realised that this gun was a liability. Early in the war, in the Battle of France and the Battle of Poland, for example, French and Polish tanks didn't have a lot of armour. They didn't have the best designs. I mean, some tanks, like the B1B for example, you could argue that they were very good tanks, because they had a lot of armour, gun was okay, but they didn't have the tactics that the German war machine used. But the Panzer III began life as multi-purpose, but the Germans saw that the gun wasn't up to scratch, so eventually they upgraded it. This is the 50mm KWK 38, which had enhanced penetration. But when they encountered the T-34 and the KV-1 on the Eastern Front, then they really had serious trouble, because even this gun, let alone this gun, could penetrate the T-34 frontally, or the KV-1, which is even more heavily armoured. But the Germans were initially very hesitant to change their guns, because they had established this 50mm and the 37mm as universally accepted and easily mountable guns. But eventually they saw the need for a better gun, and they thought, yeah, we're having some serious trouble with these Ruskies, we need a better gun. So that's where the L60 comes in, and the L60 refers to the calibers. So it's 60 calibers long. That means the gun is 60 times longer than it is across the diameter of the muzzle there. So it's 50mm in diameter, and it's 60 times longer than 50 in length. I'm afraid I don't have the figure of 60 times 50 off the top of my head, but it's quite high. So this longer barrel created a higher muzzle velocity, which meant that the T-34 and KV-1 weren't guaranteed to be penetrated, but it gave them a fighting chance. So back to the line of variants. The A, B, and C, they are all very similar, and the D for that matter. But the E introduced something quite important. You can see down here, these are called torsion bars. These springs or bars behind the road wheels. These replaced earlier models' suspension systems, which were mostly leaf springs. Now, the torsion bars were more durable, and they gave a smoother ride, and they allowed the tank to basically cross rougher terrain with less difficulty. So that was an important step. The F was the next model, and the next model featured here. Well, this had the 50mm KWK-38. More powerful high explosive shell, but it still didn't have the penetration. The muzzle velocity was lacking. The short barrel meant the muzzle velocity was left somewhat to be desired. Excuse me. So yeah, the Germans were still having problems on the Eastern Front with that gun. A few versions later, the ALSF J, which isn't featured in game, introduced the L60, which is this gun here, and this is the ALSF L. This is different to the J in the fact that it has additional armoured plates, applique plates, applied to the hull here. You see here these metal bars, strips attaching this 20mm plate onto the front of the superstructure. This bottom part is the hull, this is the superstructure, this area on top of the chassis. This is the turret mantlet, the turret itself. And additionally, there was a 20mm plate on the front of the turret here. You can see it's held on by this framework. So this meant that the Panzer IIIL, on top of the 50mm of armour underneath these plates, had another 20. So this is 70mm of armour, which is quite a lot. The L11 used on the early model T-34s and KV-1s really struggled to penetrate that. And you may be wondering why, the closed beta testers may be wondering why the L and the M got an increase in tier, because it's not obvious from the stat card, the stats, because it says 50 there. It doesn't include the spaced armour, but 70mm of armour is quite substantial, especially in an early war tank like this. So it's only really fair that they got up tiered, because that's quite a lot of armour. Speaking of the M, that was the next version. This was essentially the final version, apart from the N, which is a premium vehicle. That was just an M with a different gun. This is different because it has shirts and armoured skirts. You see these metal panels along the side of the hull, which are 5mm thick, and skirts around the turret, which are 8mm thick. And also the ALSF M had a deep wading exhaust. You can see here, that's the exhaust up there, right on top of the hull. If we go back to the L, you can see the exhausts are much lower down. There's one there, and the other one is there. So couldn't do deep wading before the M. And the final version, the very last version of the N, which is introduced in 43, is this little stubby derp gun, which you might recognise from the Panzer IV C and Panzer IV F1. It's the KWK 37 L24, which fires high explosive and heat. So that's essentially the major variants, all the variants featured in War Thunder at the current time. Now, if you're wondering how to play the Panzer III, well, it's the first variants you have to be quite cautious with, because they're fairly fragile. The guns are okay, but they're nothing to write home about. You'll struggle to penetrate T-34s and KV-1s if you face them, which you sometimes will. You won't be able to penetrate a KV-1 from the front, and you won't be able to penetrate a T-34 unless you're firing APCR at a very close range, 100 meters or less. But as you move up, you get better guns, and the KWK-39 L60, that is quite an impressive gun, especially with the APCR. You can see there the penetration up to 100 meters and up to about 250 is very impressive, and the armor as well. Compared to the Panzer IV, the earlier versions have the short-barreled howitzers, so those are going to be better for close-range engagements, but they're larger targets. So the Panzer III is smaller, it's more compact. It's more of a light medium. It's not particularly fast, but it's a small target that mounts a lighter caliber gun, so I'd recommend being fairly cautious, especially with the side armor on these tanks. It's a pretty fragile tank from the side. The front, however, is impressive. But overall, the Panzer III is a good multi-purpose tank, but you have to be careful when you face those KV-1s, because just like in real life, they are very difficult to penetrate. Well, That's the first in my series of guides. Next up will likely be the Panzer IV. I hope you enjoyed watching and listening to this, and I hope you feel like you know more about the little Panzer III. So, thank you, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.